Alright, let's try something a little different than what we normally do. No $15 deck today, and we're not going to be working by the usual building restrictions, but we are still going to be working with a gimmick. So for today's video, there is a deck type that I haven't made, and that is a precon. Now, I have made precons, technically. I've made starter decks, which are basically an attempt to build a precon out for a person. And realistically, my $15 decks are also technically pre-constructed builds, as they are builds that I've made and handed to you, and if you play as the way that I built them, I guess I'm technically building a precon. But what I haven't done is build a deck with the actual thesis of how precons are built by Wizards of the Coast. So today we are going to be building a precon around a character that most of you know very, very well, and that is Nicol Bolas himself, the original big bad villain of some of Magic's most prolific stories. I say original because, well, he is older than Yawgmoth, so I'm gonna go ahead and count it. Now, when building a precon and working within the confines of how Wizards of the Coast builds precons, there are a couple of thematic and mechanical restrictions we need to use. First of all, when Wizards of the Coast builds a precon for Commander, there are typically 90 cards which are not made for Commander, but are just cards that have existed over the course of the game's history that are used in the deck's construction, with typically 10 cards being brand new to Commander and put into those precons. Now, that number has fluctuated over the years, and we've seen that number balloon up and shrink down depending on the era of Commander that we're in, but we'll go ahead and go with 10 made for Commander cards. This means that the bulk of our deck should contain cards that have been released only in Commander pre-constructed decks, or just pre-constructed decks in general will be the limitation that we use. This means if a card was deemed reasonable enough to show up in a Planeswalker deck, or a Pioneer or Standard pre-constructed deck, or a Challenger deck, or was deemed perfectly reasonable to be in a Commander pre-constructed deck, it can make its way into our deck without working against our 10 card restriction for cards that have not made their way into any of those decks. However, if a card's name is Nicol Bolas, these will also not count towards the restriction, as this is the theme of the deck that we are going with. The next thing we need to do is make sure that the deck is very on theme with who Nicol Bolas is as a character. Nicol Bolas, for a time, was the most powerful being in Magic's entire multiverse. This means one of the first thematic restrictions we need to build is make a deck that operates as an archenemy deck. Nicol Bolas was also known as the Deceiver, pitting friends against each other in a bid to make sure that he always had the most powerful political hand in any position that he was vying for. This means that we will want to have a theme of pitting our opponents against each other, which means there are a couple of mechanics we can use to do this. One of them would be the goad mechanic, causing our opponents to hit each other, but that's not really in line with how I view Nicol Bolas as a character. I think straight up theft is going to be far more on theme for who he is as a person. He can manipulate people to be against each other, but he can also just, I don't know, make sure their contracts go into default so that they have no choice but to work under him in servitude. You know, like he did to Liliana. Speaking of her, the fact that she is in fact one of the most prolific characters whose story is attached to Nicol Bolas, thanks to the aforementioned defaulting of her contract with all of the demons that the Gatewatch was trying to eliminate on her behalf, we need to make sure that there's at least one Liliana in the deck to represent that part of his story. Speaking of his story, thematic cards like Eldest Reborn and Shadow of the Second Sun, as well as Sphinx of the Second Sun, should make their way into the deck as they directly reference events from Bolas's life. This will also influence the inclusion of powerful cards like Bolas's Citadel in this deck build. However, the primary goal of this deck will be less theming and more mechanical, because I am interested in making sure that this is an effective archenemy deck. I feel like the feeling of being Nicol Bolas lies not just in the mechanical power of your cards, but also in the effect psychologically that those cards can have on your opponent. So, having strong cards is not enough. We need to make ourselves a guaranteed threat at the table that people want to eliminate. We need to become the archenemy of our game. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the deck list proper. Nicol Bolas the Ravager is a Grixis and 1/4/4 dragon behemoth. He is an elder dragon and the youngest of them to boot. He has flying, and whenever he enters the battlefield, each opponent will discard a card. This will automatically put all of our opponents on the back foot because they will not want to get rid of their potential resources. We can also pay a amount of mana, 7 in this case, to flip Nicol Bolas around into his Planeswalker form, Nicol Bolas the Arisen. This allows us to plus it by 2 to draw 2 cards, neg him by 3 to deal 10 damage to a creature or a Planeswalker, neg him by 4 to take any creature from any graveyard and put it on the battlefield under our control, or neg him by 12 to exile all but the bottom card of a player's library. Now, it should be noted that when we are playing any deck with Planeswalkers as a central theme, trying to ult the Planeswalkers in most scenarios is not a good idea. We should not build decks based on an idea that just doesn't happen all that often and is too easy to interact with. So we are mostly going to be focusing on the first 3 abilities of our Nicol Bolas. If the -12 ever happens, then that will be neat, but we are not going to be building around the fact that it can. That said, when precons are designed by Wizards of the Coast, they always have a secondary commander who can be selected in the slot instead. And thankfully for us, for this secondary commander, we can definitely stroke our dragon's ego by adding another Nicol Bolas in that second slot. This Nicol Bolas, the original one, makes you pay Grixis in your upkeep or you sacrifice him, but if he ever deals combat damage to a player, then that player will discard their entire hand, immediately putting them on the back foot and causing them to try to barter with the other players at the table for gains against us. Now, to help facilitate the theme of our deck, we are also going to be including every Nicol Bolas we can possibly add in. Whether or not they are good or work with our deck, this is part of the deck that is dedicated to our theme and therefore can make mechanical sacrifices if we need to. But good for us, most Nicol Bolases are pretty good. Nicol Bolas Dragon God has all the loyalty abilities of all the other Planeswalkers on the board, and also allows us to draw a card and exile cards from opponents' hands. Then we can also neg him by 3 to blow up any creature or Planeswalker, and if we happen to ult him, then anybody who doesn't have a legendary creature or Planeswalker loses the game automatically. Nicol Bolas God Pharaoh lets us plus him by 2 to exile cards from the top of an opponent's library until we get a non-land card. Then we get to cast that card for free. His +1 makes every opponent exile 2 cards from their hand, allowing us to constantly shred their cards away. This works really well with the archenemy theming of our deck. His -4 allows him to deal 7 damage to an opponent or a creature, a very good way to close out the game on somebody who is weak and unable to defend themselves, and his -12 exiles each non-land permanent all of our opponents controls. Then we have Nicol Bolas Planeswalker. His +3 lets us blow up a non-creature permanent, his -2 lets us gain control of a creature forever, and his -9 ult deals 7 damage to a player, forces them to discard 7 cards, and then makes them sacrifice 7 permanents. Yeah, if that happens, that player's just out of the game. I'm sorry, that they're just not recovering from that. In most cases, you don't go neg 14 and also take 7 to the dome and survive. Then we have the bad Bolas, Nicol Bolas the Deceiver. This one originally came in the Nicol Bolas the Deceiver precon, a really bad precon from back when every standard set had what were called Planeswalker decks as their introductory deck. I liked Planeswalker decks when you played against other Planeswalker decks, but in terms of being an actual entry into the standard format, they were really bad. They always only had one of their Planeswalker, and their Planeswalker was always really awful. In this case, Nicol Bolas the Deceiver's +3 makes every opponent lose 3 life, unless they choose to sack a non-land permanent or discard a card. They can just ignore your -3 by cracking a treasure token. Then his -3 destroys a creature and draws us a card. This is a fine effect on a commander that had more loyalty and didn't cost 8 mana. Unfortunately, his cost is exorbitant, and he doesn't have a lot of loyalty to begin with. His -11 deals 7 damage to every opponent and then draws us 7 cards, which is a good ult, but again, we're not really banking on getting to that ult. I do want to focus a little bit on Nicol Bolas the Deceiver while we are here. His precon was built on the back of cards like Eternal of Harsh Truths, cards that had the ability to burn our opponents for, just attacking people. And for some reason, the way Moxfield has this set up, I can't really look at these the way I normally do. That's the problem with how I make videos, I guess. But his precon is something that I think the Afflict mechanic is fine and fun to build a deck around. Maybe we'll even make an Afflict deck in the future, but it really doesn't do a whole lot to synergize with Bolas himself in Planeswalker form. But luckily for us, we're just going to be running him as our 6th Bolas. But that is not all. We still have plenty more to get into for how this deck is going to operate. 2 of our Nicol Bolases need to be able to make impact with players' faces to give us maximum usage of them as commanders. We have the original Nicol Bolas, who needs to make people discard cards, and our Nicol Bolas we've chosen as the commander, who needs to be able to put people on the back foot with commander damage. So we've included a single copy of Anger, as it did appear in several precons. We also have Teferi's Talent and Thrumming Bird to help out all of our other Nicol Bolases who are Planeswalkers alone. Both of these cards also appeared in precons, so being able to proliferate with Thrumming Bird or being able to turn all of our draws into loyalty counters on a Planeswalker are fantastic abilities to abuse Nicol Bolas. Next, because we have so many Nicol Bolases that are Planeswalkers, we need creatures that are able to accurately defend them. Cards that can stand in the way of Bolas himself, and the best combination of abilities to block creatures in Magic the Gathering is Flying and Death Touch. This blocks most problematic creatures and also threatens them with death. So we have a Baleful Strix with Flying and Death Touch, allowing us to draw a card when it touches the board. Nighthawk Scavenger, which has Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink, allowing us to play long games with people, and it also gains lots of power based on people's graveyards. Then we have Vampire Nighthawk, which is just the lower budget version of Vampire Nighthawk Scavenger. Has Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink, and that is about it. We also want to be able to cheat out our big Bolas and also be able to reanimate our own Bolas if it dies, so we are going to be running a reanimation package. But because we are focusing on the theme of Nicol Bolas, all of our cards that reanimate need to either be a card associated with his story, like Liliana Death's Majesty, or needs to be a card that grabs a creature from any player's graveyard so that we can continue the theme of stealing cards from our opponent. So we have an Animate Dead, which can take cards from opponents' graveyards and attach the Animate Dead to them, Necromancy, which can do it as well with a bunch of superfluous text to try to explain how weird, effectively, Magic the Gathering Call of the Haunted is, and then we have a Reanimate to take cards from people's graveyards at the cost of our life. Finally, that Liliana Death's Majesty allows us to mill 2 cards, making zombie tokens, or we can use her to return any creature card from our graveyard to our battlefield by giving it the zombie creature type as well. The only reason that this is being kept in is because it is one of the best reanimations attached to a Liliana, and we have to pick at least one Liliana to go in, and it was either her or Dreadhorde General. Dreadhorde General is far more thematic, but doesn't work as well mechanically with our deck. Next, we have our Second Son section. Anything that either deals with the Second Son or allows us to get extra copies of Nicol Bolas will be here. We have Sinks of the Second Son, which gives us an extra beginning phase during after our post-combat phase. Then we have a Shadow of the Second Son, which does the same thing. Then we have Spark Double, which can be used to clone any creature or planeswalker on the battlefield, giving us access to more Nicol Bolases while stripping them of their legendary typing. Then we have Endless Evil, a very fitting name for a card in a deck about Bolas, and I can imagine a card like this getting all kinds of new artworks to facilitate those upgrades in the future. Endless Evil enchants a creature we control, and at the beginning of our upkeep, we create a creature token that is a copy of that enchanted creature, and that token becomes a 1/1. Thankfully for us, only 2 of these cards, Spark Double and Shadow of the Second Sun, did not appear in precons. So these are 2 cards counting towards our precon limit. Endless Evil was in the Baldur's Gate precons, and being able to create multiple copies of Nicol Bolas that will automatically die, but will be able to keep people from keeping hands by making them discard cards constantly, or create extra copies of Shadow of the Second, or Sphinx of the Second Sun, can create a very nasty scenario where we draw far more cards than our opponents are comfortable with. Next, we don't want to just be taking cards from our opponent's graveyard. We also want some cards that will allow us to steal cards from our opponents outright via various means. So this is where we have our 6-card What's Yours is Mine section. We are going to begin with Thief of Sanity, which thankfully did appear in a precon. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we look at the top 3 cards of that player's library. We exile one of them face down and put the rest in their graveyard, which we can then reanimate later. We can cast the card we chose at any point as long as we have the mana to cast it. Then we have a new card from Foundations, which has not made its way into a precon yet, the Abyssal Harvester. We can tap this to exile a creature card from a graveyard that was put there this turn and create a token that is a copy of it, except it is a nightmare. Then we get rid of all of our other nightmare tokens once we do this. The fact that all of our Bolas Planeswalkers have the ability to either make people discard cards or blow up those cards outright means we will always have access to any card that we steal away from our opponents. With this card, we can just blow up one of their important game pieces or make them discard one and then automatically reanimate it because the Abyssal Harvester doesn't care where the card came from in the first place. Then we have another card that was not in a precon, Breach the Multiverse. Each player mills 10 cards, and then we will reanimate a creature from every player's graveyard. This is a fantastic bomb that I have found makes you the archenemy the instant you cast it, so we are going to be running this thing as fast as humanly possible. Then we have the cards that have appeared in precons for this deck. Notion Thief steals people's ability to draw from their decks outside of drawing cards naturally. Diluvian Primordial casts spells from every player's graveyard, and Superclal Primordial allows us to reanimate cards from every player's graveyard as long as they are our opponents. And that does it for the gist of the core strategy of the deck. We are going to be taking our opponent's cards, using them against them, and annihilating their boards like a control deck, all in the attempt to be the archenemy of the game from the get-go. That said, we do still need to make sure that we have plenty of cards in our hand because you can't be the archenemy if you're completely devoid of resources. So let's go ahead and talk about our draw section, at least the draw cards that don't say, you know, Nicol Bolas. We are going to be running an 11-card draw package, and thankfully for us, only 1, 2, 3 of these cards did not appear in a precon, so they are going to count towards our limit. Let's go ahead and talk about the cards that did not appear in precons first, beginning with Pirate's Pillage. This lets us discard a card, draw 2 cards, and create 2 treasure tokens, allowing us to ramp into our bigger Nicol Bolases. It's sided with the cards, it's basically the same as the cards, called Unexpected Windfall and Big Score, that both do basically the same thing, but at instant speed. These also managed to appear in precons, so these don't count towards our limit and allow us to effectively have multiple copies of Pirate's Pillage. Then we have Motzalani the Great Door. This allows us to draw a card and discard a card, and then we can flip it into its backside, which gives us a fuck ton of mana to play with later in the game, based on the amount of permanents in our graveyard. Motzalani is effectively a looter effect, and we can double up on those looter effects with cards that did appear in precons, Merfolk Looter and Moira Scavenger. Finally, there is the Bolas' Citadel, allowing us to do some top deck manipulation of our deck to cast spells for free as long as we have the life to pay for it from the top of our deck. And like every other card we've talked about so far, it is supplemented by a single card that was in precons recently, one with the Multiverse, allowing us to cast spells for free from our hand or from the top of our deck, but allowing us to see the top of our deck at any point. Then we have Fact or Fiction, which has appeared in precons, thank God, allowing us to reveal the top 5 cards of our deck and give them to an opponent. Then they separate those cards into piles, and we choose one pile to go into our hand and one pile to go into the graveyard. This gives us both reanimation targets and also allows us to play mind games with our opponents, which is basically what we wanted to do. There was another version of this deck before I imposed the building restrictions that also included cards like Hostile Negotiations and Sauron's Ransom, so that I had more ways of giving opponents the ability to get angry at each other for making the wrong choices with these cards. But after the deck building restriction, only the strongest of those cards survives. We will also be running a Teferi's Ageless Insight, so that every time we use cards like Merfolk Looter or Moira Scavenger or Tezzeret's Gambit, we will be able to draw extra cards off of that. And several of our Boluses draw cards too, so this card will always be guaranteed to give us what we want. Then, of course, we have Tezzeret's Gambit, which allows us to draw 2 cards, then proliferate, letting us bulk up on counters on our Planeswalkers, and also just dig through our deck at a reasonable rate. And that does it for drawing through our deck. That gives us a lot of cards to dig through our deck with, thanks to the opportunities Bolas presents us with on his own, but we still need to make sure that one of the most important parts of Magic the Gathering are respected: cucking our opponents out of their cards. This deck is running a 9-card removal package due to the fact that all of our Boluses have some way to remove cards on top of them. So we are effectively running closer to a 15-card removal package, if you don't count our board wipes, of which we're running 4. That said, when we look at the cards that did not appear in precons, we are running a Virtue of Persistence, and that's really about it. Virtue of Persistence allows us to remove a creature from the battlefield as long as it has 3 toughness or less by giving it -3/-3 and gaining 2 life for us, and later in the game we can cast it to reanimate cards from any player's graveyard, letting us do more spell thieving shenanigans. Onto the cards that did appear in precons though, we have Eldest Reborn, showcasing parts of Bolas's life. This card says each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Then it forces every opponent to discard a card, and then it puts a creature or planeswalker from any graveyard onto our battlefield, giving us more access to our opponent's creatures. Then we have a Vandal Blast to get rid of all of our opponent's artifacts all at once, Drawing the Lock to give us a good counterspell that can also blow up cards, Counterspell and Arcane Denial to give us 2 very good generic counterspells to have access to, Feed the Swarm to get rid of creatures and enchantments, Chaos Warp to get rid of any kind of permanent type on the board we might need, and a Hostage Taker to give us Exile as a removal option, as well as yet another way to steal our opponent's cards and use them for our own nefarious gains. Then we have the board wipes of the deck, and only one of these did not appear in precons, though I don't know how long that's going to be true. Blasphemous Edict is our one board wipe that is new to the precon game. This card allows us to pay black instead of its mana cost to make everybody sacrifice 13 creatures if there are at least 13 creatures on the battlefield. This is a fantastic board wipe that I can't wait to see if Wizards will actually throw it into any of their precons, because we've already seen several instances where its brother Blasphemous Act has made it into precons, dealing 13 damage to every creature. Then we have Necromantic Selection, which lets us blow up all creatures on the board, then return any creature card from a graveyard into play on our board. Yet another way to steal our opponent's cards and use them for our own gains. Then we have the Nipton Lottery, which chooses any creature at random and gains us control of that creature until the end of turn. Then we untap it, it gains haste until the end of turn, then we destroy all the other creatures, giving us a low mana board wipe and the ability to fuck with our opponent's board states even more by stealing more stuff from them, all wrapped up in a single card. This is a fantastically thematic card for our Bolas Thieving Archenemy deck. And that does it for all of our removal options. Between our Boluses and all of our other cards, we're sitting at 19 ways to screw with our opponent's deck, which are really, it makes me feel really mean, but we're an Archenemy deck, so that's kind of what we're going for. That said, let's go ahead and move into Ramp, because some of the cards in this deck are awfully expensive. We're going to be running a 12-card ramp section so that we can try to very quickly get to our various Bolases, and thankfully every single one of these cards has made its way into a precon at some point in time. This makes our job very, very easy, but let's start with the most interesting one of all of these, and that is Visage of Bolas. Now, this is not a good mana rock. This is not a good mana rock in any way, shape, or form, but it does give us the unique ability to go into our deck and tutor out Nicol Bolas the Deceiver specifically. This card was added into the Nicol Bolas the Deceiver deck specifically so that you would be able to grab him out at any point. Now, this card does operate as a 3-mana mana rock, but it costs 4 mana, so it's uniquely bad. But it is very thematic, so we are willing to make that sacrifice for our deck. Next, we can get lands out of our deck using Wayfarer's Bauble and Solemn Simulacrum, and as far as our mana rocks, we have the complementary Soul Ring and Arcane Signet that come in every commander deck, and then we have Dimir Signet and Rakdos Signet, along with Talisman of Indulgence and Talisman of Dominance. Each of these are being ran because our least represented color in the entire deck, unfortunately, is red, with blue being the follow-up less represented color, but not by a whole lot. So we need to be focusing very heavy on the black mana symbols and only run the mana rocks that give us access to those symbols for mana fixing. But for cards that give us access to all of those colors, we have the amazing Relic of Sauron in here as well, allowing us to add 2 mana of any combination of Grixis colors, and also gives us a draw engine on top of it. Then we have the Warren Power Stone, which allows us access to 2 colorless mana at a rate of 3, and Treasure Nabber, which allows us to use all of our opponent's mana rocks against them, leaning even harder into the Spell Thief theme. Finally, and this was a very fun one for me, let's go ahead and build a mana base where we don't have a budgetary restriction, but we must use only mana that has been produced by precons. Only things that have appeared in precons for us. So we've of course got 2 mountains, 4 islands, and 5 swamps, making up the same mana variety you saw in the amount of pits we have in the deck earlier. Same reason we have our color weighting the way that we do in our mana rocks. Then we have checklands, because all the checklands have been produced in various precons. So we have Sulphur Falls, Drowned Catacombs, and Dragon Skull Summit. The fetching lands Grixis Panorama and Myriad Landscape, as those also have made their way into various precons. Then the filter lands Darkwater Catacombs, Ferris Lake, and Shadowblood Ridge. Each of these have been in several precons, with Ferris Lake even originating from a precon. Then we have the Omni lands Command Tower, Crumbling Necropolis, and Exotic Orchard. Now, normally I wouldn't care to run Crumbling Necropolis, but for our purposes, every single time there's a 3-color commander deck, Wizards always puts this damn thing in there, so we are going to go ahead and do the same. Then we are running one of every Pain land, because every Pain land has made its way into a precon at some point. And the Reveal lands, which also make their way into precons all the damn time, as well as the Tango lands, Sunken Hollow and Smoldering Marsh, and the Tainted lands, Tainted Peak and Tainted Isle. We also have the unique dual River of Tears, which is basically an island that sometimes turns into a swamp. And then we have a category that I have cheekily called, These Were in Precons, I Promise You. This is where we have Fiery Islet, Steam Vents, and Watery Grave. Steam Vents and Watery Grave. I know, you're scratching your head right now. But to help with any of that confusion, I would like to introduce you to one of my favorite precons that has ever been produced by Wizards of the Coast. This is the Dimir Control precon, with multiple copies of Narset, Torrential Gearhulk, Extinction Event, and it's got everything. Drown in the Loch, Negate, Dig Through Time, Mystical Dispute. But if we go past the Shark Typhoon into the land base, there was a single copy of Watery Grave printed in each of these precons. And if we flip over to the Is It Phoenix deck, then the same thing. The weird building cost of not putting 4 Arc-like Phoenixes in here makes me hate this thing. But if you look into the land base, there was a single copy of Steam Vents in every single one of these precons. And somehow people still didn't want to play Pioneer. I don't understand. The format is fantastic. It is a hilarious game style. It's just standard with all kinds of extra cards in it. It's fun. Please play Pioneer. It's so fun. I beg of you. That said, back to the cards. We do get to include Watery Grave, Steam Vents, and Fiery Islet, as each of them have made their way into precons in the past. And finally, we have the utility lands Karn's Bastion and Bojuka Bog, as they have also made their way into precons several times. And that does it for the entirety of the deck. Our goal is to steal our opponent's stuff. Our methods are going to be Wizards of the Coast precons with a little bit of flavor, and all that's left to do is show you how to pilot it. So let's go ahead and get into that. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. Any hand that allows us to get Nicol Bolas out on turn 3 is a keepable hand. And looking at what we've got a Tainted Isle, Mountain, Island, and a couple of Signets and Rocks. We are golden to start this game out in just glorious fashion. We get the Tainted Isle out, move into turn 2, we play a Mountain, tap 2, and get ourselves a Rakdos Signet on the board. Then we move into turn 3. There's a Baleful Strix. Let's go ahead and play that island and tap 1, 2, 3. And turn 3, here is Nicol Bolas making everybody lose a card and punching somebody in the face in the following turn if nobody gets rid of him. Moving into turn 4, we have a Foreboding Ruins. Let's go ahead and drop that on the board tapped. Let's go ahead and pay 1, 2. Let's get Talisman of Dominance on the board, and then we'll pay 1, 2, 3, and get that Mozzolante on the board so that we have access to a looting effect. We'll punch a player with Nicol Bolas, and then we will move into our next turn after using Mozzolante to get rid of our Sphinx of the Second Sun. Then, as we draw for our turn, we have a Talisman of Indulgence. Let's go ahead and get an engine online. We are going to tap our Mozzolante once more to draw a card, and we've drawn a Smoldering Marsh. Now we have a couple of options. We can either flip our Nicol Bolas, or we can accept the fact that that's not gonna work out for us very well if we don't have something defending him. So let's go ahead and set up a defense for Bolas. We're gonna pay 2 mana, and we're gonna get that Talisman of Indulgence out, and then we're gonna use that Talisman and this Tainted Isle, and we are going to go ahead and get Baleful Strix on the board, drawing us a card. Then we are going to tap 2, 3, and we are going to put Endless Evil on the Baleful Strix. Now, at the beginning of our upkeep, we will create another copy of the Baleful Strix, giving us 2 Death Touch blockers with flying that will also operate as a draw engine for us. So we move into turn 6, our Baleful Strix gets copied, we have an extra one of these, and that draws us an extra card every turn. Now, we can go ahead and play our Smoldering Marsh, which we should have played last turn. That was my bad. Let's go ahead and tap 7 of these, and let's turn Nicol Bolas over. Now we have the ability to either draw 2 cards, snipe a creature, or put a creature or planeswalker onto the battlefield from our graveyard. We are going to go ahead, since we don't know what cards our opponents are playing, we are going to subtract him by 4, go into our graveyard, and reanimate that Sphinx of the Second Sun that we put in there a while ago, giving us another ability to draw cards. So when we go into our end phase, we will untap all of these and we will draw an extra card with Sphinx of the Second Sun. Now, on our opponent's turn, we can tap Mozzolante, draw yet another card, and discard this swamp that we don't need, and we can hold on to these cards to hurt our opponent if we need to. We move into turn 7, we clone Baleful Strix yet again, and we get to draw an extra card thanks to cloning the Baleful Strix. Let's go ahead and put Shadowblood Ridge on the board, and let's see what we have here. We don't want to neg Nicol Bolas to kill a creature, because that would kill him at this point, but that may not be the worst thing in the world to do. So let's take a look at what we've got. If we have a very powerful card in an opponent's graveyard, then what we're going to do is we are going to proliferate Bolas with Tezzeret's Gambit, and then we are going to neg him by 4 to steal their creature, let Bolas die, and then bring Bolas back with Necromancy, forcing our opponents to discard more cards. If, however, we are not in a position that we need to do that, we are free to either snipe a creature off the board or draw 2 cards. We can't see the board state, so let's go ahead and Goldfish by drawing cards. We're going to tap 1, 2, 3, 4, and get Teferi's Ageless Insight on the board. With Teferi's Ageless Insight on the board, every time we draw a card, we're going to draw 2 instead. So we will plus Nicol Bolas by 2, allowing us to draw 4 cards. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 mana available, or we have 8 mana total, but only a little bit of this is currently available to us. So let's look at our opponents and just tap 1, 2, get that Arcane Signet on the board. And at this point, I think the best thing we can do is use the Tezzeret's Gambit to get a little more card draw out. Let's go ahead and use that to draw 1, 2, 3, 4 cards. That's going to go into the graveyard. And now we can just do whatever we want. We tap the Mozzolante to draw 2, And we don't need every single card in our hand, so let's go ahead and start dumping things out as our turn ends. We also get another extra 2 draws thanks to our Sync for the Second Sun. We're going to pitch an Anger to the graveyard because that is just a fantastic thing to do at this stage of the game. We have a Spark Double we can play here. We don't need this Swamp. God, we have so many cards in our hand, and we have to make choices about which ones go away. We could Eldest Reborn. We could throw that away. I think we definitely need to hold on to the Drown in the Log. So we're going to pitch that Swamp away. We are going to pitch this Necromantic Selection away. And we are going to pitch the Eldest Reborn away for now. We get to untap all of these cards because we go into our beginning phase. And remember, every time we have a beginning phase, we're actually spawning Baleful Strixes. I haven't been thinking about that. Spawning Baleful Strixes draws us extra cards. And now that we've got even more Baleful Strixes out, making it impossible to get to our Nicol Bolas, on our opponent's turn, we are just going to tap 1, 2, 3, 4. We know we're going to Unexpected Windfall, and we know we're going to use Drown in the Lock to get rid of whatever cards they cast. Botsolani will allow us to draw 2 cards and discard 1 card, and Unexpected Windfall will allow us to discard a card to draw 4 cards and generate 2 treasure tokens. If you can notice, we are so obnoxiously far ahead of everyone that it is very hard. It is incredibly hard to argue that we are not the biggest threat on the fucking planet. We move into our next turn, spawning yet another Baleful Strix and drawing 2 cards thanks to spawning the Baleful Strix. We have a hand of 14 cards. Let's go ahead and play a Bojuka Bog. Let's get rid of a player's grave. They don't need that anymore. Let's go ahead and pay 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and put 1 with the Multiverse on the board. Now we can look at the top card of our deck and see if we ever want to cast it. Right now, we don't. So what we are going to do is we are going to use 1 with the Multiverse to spawn Nicol Bolas Planeswalker. Now we have the ability to just gain control of an opponent's creature whenever we damn well choose. Looking at our hand right now, we... let's see here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. At this stage, I actually think, you know what? At this stage, no, we don't do that. We do something infinitely more mean. Actually, we don't have the mana to do it. We don't have the mana to do it right now. I wanted to put Teferi's Talent on the board. Instead, let's go ahead and pay 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's play... Not Speak to the Second Sun. We're going to play Spark Double as a copy of Nicol Bolas Planeswalker. It's going to come out with... Let's go ahead and put it down here the way it is, and it gets an extra loyalty counter when it comes out, and we're going to neg him by 2 to steal an opponent's card. We have 2 cards from our opponents. We have the ability to see the top of our deck. We are in an obnoxiously powerful position. As we move to ending the turn, we spawn our extra Baleful Strix, drawing us our extra 2 cards, causing us to get rid of 1, 2, 3, and God, it's so hard to choose which cards to get rid of, but I guess we almost always get rid of lands at this stage, because, I mean, realistically, what are we going to do with them? These treasures are also gone. I don't know why I tapped those. So we're going to get rid of... Let's go ahead and say Shadow of the Second Sun, because we're only going to have 1 more turn anyway for this Goldfish. We get to untap all of these when our second phase begins. So let's go ahead and untap all of these right now. Boop. Wow, that is not untapping. There we are. Now they are all untapped. Now we get to pay 1, 2, 3, 4 on an opponent's turn and play Big Score. This will allow us to discard any card out of our hand, which of course we're going to Mazzolanti first. There we go. Now we know the cards we're discarding are these lands. To draw 1, 2, 3, 4 off the top and generate another 2 treasures for an incredibly bombastic final turn. We'll go ahead and organize things a little better for this turn. Let's go ahead and make the first spell that we cast after we drop a land on the board. We're going to pay 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and Teferi's Talent is going to be on the board. This will say that whenever we draw a card, we will put a loyalty counter on Enchanted Planeswalker. So let's go ahead and say that that Planeswalker is going to be this Nicol Bolas. This one that is going to just hurt somebody so hard they are going to be just not happy with how life goes. We get to tap Matsalanti to draw 2 cards and discard a card. That will add 2 loyalty counters to the Bolas. Then we can tap 1, 2, 3 and play the Moira Scavenger, allowing us to tap, discard a card, and draw 2 cards, putting 2 more loyalty counters onto the Nicol Bolas. Now, if we had any other draw cards, we would be able to put more counters on it, but we don't need draw cards when we can just play Thrumming Bird, which will allow us to proliferate if it punches anybody. That is out now, and we still have a free spell to cast thanks to our One with the Multiverse. We look at the top card of our deck, we see it's a Watery Grave. So that card's kind of a dud for us at the moment. So we're going to use our free cast of One with the Multiverse to cast Diluvian Primordial, stealing 3 spells from all of our opponents. Then we are going to use 2 mana to cast Virtue of Persistence and use this to get rid of any problematic creatures that may exist on the board. Now, we are going to enter combat, and this Thrumming Bird is going to punch somebody in the face. Let's pretend that throughout the game, our Baleful Strixes and Sphinx of the Second Sons have been hitting our opponents this entire time. The Thrumming Bird hits, and we get to pump up each of our commanders by giving them another counter. Now that we've done that, we can just auto-ult this Nicol Bolas for shits and giggles, just to make one player feel absolutely rubbed raw in the backside, making them lose 7 permanents, making them discard 7 cards, and making them take 7 damage. We still haven't plussed our Nicol Bolases for the turn, so we can go ahead and plus our big boy Nicol Bolas, or we can neg him by 4 to just reanimate a card from any player's grave, probably an opponent's grave. And Nicol Bolas Planeswalker will neg him by 2 and steal yet another card from any of our opponents. As we end our turn, we're just going to get rid of the superfluous lands we don't need at this point, and untap everything and have another set of draws. We have an insane amount of card advantage, an insane amount of pressure on everybody, and all it took was being a fucking shithead with mostly cards that only existed in Commander precons. It's kind of insane. Normally in this section, I would talk about the upgrades that the deck needs, but I'm going to be honest, I think that defeats the purpose of the entire video. I don't think the deck necessarily needs any major upgrades in order to function. If you really wanted to lean into the Planeswalker theme, you could add cards like Dreamtide Whale, I guess, and if you wanted to lean further into the theme of messing with your opponent's stuff, then cards like Stonespeaker Crystal can get rid of graveyards while ramping for big boluses, Helm of Possession can be used to repeatedly steal opponents' cards, and cards like Aura Thief are fantastic at pitting your opponents against each other. How dare you play enchantments on the board while my Aura Thief steals all of them from everyone all at once. There's also the thematic include you could choose if you wanted of Cruel Ultimatum in order to give you a big burly spell. I chose not to put it in the deck because it didn't seem to work very well with the deck's theme, but the card is very bolusy if you so chose. But I don't want to focus too much on upgrades for this particular deck because realistically that's not the point of this. The point of this is to get in the brain of Magic the Gathering game designers and try to build a deck the way that they would build a deck. Have a secondary commander in there, run 38 to 39 lands, make sure that all the cards available, regardless of how much they cost on the secondary market, are cards that routinely show up in precons. Allow yourself 10 cards that are going to be used for new to Commander designs. But since we can't design our own cards, we're going to go ahead and add in cards that just work with the deck's theme, but do not necessarily constitute cards that have been in precons previously. That all said, I do think this is a ridiculously fun deck if you like playing Archenemy. I think that it is great to have a deck that does not do the standard build around your commander, but instead be themed off of what your commander does literally in the story of Magic the Gathering. Seriously, Nicol Bolas is a fantastically egotistical villain who they literally had to lock in a meditation chamber, because if they didn't lock him in that realm, he was just going to resurrect. He had to be stripped of all names so people couldn't summon him. He pitted planeswalkers against each other. He started riots on fucking planes. The dude is insane with the amount of overreaching power he has had over the course of Magic's story. And if you've ever read the Time Spiral books, there is a moment where Teferi decides to square up to Bolas and gets his ass handed to him, trying to ask him to sacrifice his spark to mend shit around the multiverse. He's a fantastic villain, and I think that we should have more decks that are built around these villains of the game. Bolas is a character who I wanted to build a deck for a while, and I'm glad that y'all have sat here and listened to me just gush about this really thing that only I care about. I can't really explain it in any other words, except only I give a shit about what this deck is and what it does. But I'm always going to be very excited to talk about this stuff on my channel, even if my throat is trying to tell me that the wintertime is very sick. This is not just an animated background. I need to put on more clothes out here. Holy shit. That said, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already. Subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, everybody, insert end of video tagline here.
Hey, just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help keep me afloat and help keep this channel going. YouTube and Twitch are wonderful platforms, but at the end of the day, stability is not one of their strong suits. If you want to support my channel, then obviously Patreon is one of the best ways of doing that. Link is in the description. But I do want to personally thank everybody who has contributed to the channel. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravalern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Autumn and Angel, Nixie Chan, Agamotto, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fire Shard. And everyone else who supports my channel and lets me do what I do full time. This is a dream job of mine that I never believed that I would be able to take full time, and with your help I've been able to do it. So thank you so very much for that. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you all enjoy, and I hope you all are having a wonderful time. I will see you all in the next one, hopefully.